part of the reason, I mean, even in my comment, I kind of mentioned like I found your article really, really interesting and really meaningful, but I found it like it took a lot of focus to like try to make sure I was following along with what you were doing, because I mean you were bridging some pretty big gaps. I mean, fundamentally it seemed kind of like the article is sort of syncretism. I'm not sure how to make that an adjective.
I hope it's not syncretic. I think syncretic typically is about like pulling things together that don't necessarily fit.
Well, okay, if that's part of the definitions that they don't fit, then sure. But I mean, you're certainly trying to bridge some gaps between like Christianity and Buddhism, and it seems like Hinduism and just spirituality in general, right?
Yeah, just a bit, yeah. Mainly with Buddhism because of the conversation with John.
Yeah. Though I noticed, I mean, I made kind of a list of like the way you started out the whole article was like, you know, you established this kind of cosmic threeness that all of these religions tend to start with, even whether or not they're religious or not, because I think this goes into like Vervake's perspective too is like this, but it's not intrinsically, or he's not trying to be religious with his cosmology, but like there's like a trinity that shapes reality essentially. I mean, and you're kind of relating it to the Trinity, right? Although I think you do it slightly differently. But let me just kind of read through really quick. Yeah. I can read your first paragraph, or actually I kind of listed it out here. You have, so there's 3 categories, right? We have the we have emptiness or sunyata. I'm not sure if those are the same thing exactly. Is that right? Emptiness and sunyata are essentially, sunyata is like a kind of extreme emptiness.
I think like if I recall, like you go through emptiness to get to sunyata. It's sort of a state.
Okay.
Yeah.
But emptiness at least.
I don't use those terms often enough. I would have to actually check to be sure.
I just started reading Nishitani's thing too, and I was getting to that word, and I was like, what is it? There's so much terminology. I mean, that was partially what I found was really great, even just about the introduction to this article, is that you make some you tie up all these different all this terminology from all these different traditions and kind of suddenly make it make sense a little bit if you have some exposure to some of those words.
Yeah, but it's a really useful framework. I don't go into a full-fledged defense of it because it would require sort of its own article, really. And I've also explained at least bits and pieces of it elsewhere. So I just refer people to David Bentler's book, like if they want all the details. But like the basic framework is super powerful.
Yeah.
Like there's potential and there's a ground of being. You can and different religions have called it differently, but like there's a place from which you see potential, but this potential doesn't just sort of happen willy-nilly. There are constraints on it. There's intelligible constraints on it, and then other traditions again have different ways of speaking about this constraining, like whether it's consciousness, whether it's the intellect, it's the logos. Like you always have like some top-down thing that constrains the potential. Yeah. And then the third category that remains is the meet, like what exactly makes those two ends meet. And
or like a mediator between them.
Yeah, I don't know if mediator is...
It's at least where they're meeting, so whether or not maybe mediator implies a little bit of something extra.
It's kind of their finality too. I don't know if mediator works with...
Well, see, I want to see if this works, because you did 5 examples here, and I want to try and talk through all 5 of those, and then talk about 10 more if I can, and see if that helps to kind of, because if you've like read a little bit of Buddhist stuff, or if you've like been deep in this symbolic world community, following like Pageau's work, or you start to kind of develop some familiarity with these concepts. But I want to see if we can kind of build that from the ground up and make sure it totally makes sense, even if you don't have a. I mean, we've got some time here. I don't know how late you can go, but
I can do. Well, it depends on how it goes and how focused I can keep.
Okay.
But I have much more time than last time because now it's like we started pretty early, so that's better at least. But I mean, if I get fried, then it's over. But so at least off the bat, I have more time. Yeah.
So let's start with the 5 that you talked about. So these are 5 different traditions: the Buddhism, and then Vervake's kind of worldview, and then Christianity, Taoism, and I think maybe this other one's David Bentley Hart, and then Hinduism. So Buddhism's is they have emptiness, which is just the ground of being, which is just like the energy of life that has not been shaped yet, or something like that. And then Dharma is the constraints on that emptiness. when it becomes manifest, and then enlightenment is sort of the meeting of those two. Is that right?
It's a good question. I'm not sure that they have. I don't know what exactly the category would be for the meeting in Buddhism. I didn't include it in the third category. Yeah. Maybe it would be like, I don't know if you've gotten to this part of Nishitani's book, but he talks about King Samadhi, or sometimes it could also maybe be Sunyata. But like there's a place where you get to unite emptiness with Dharma, I guess, where you see like the whole hierarchy fit together. And this would be the third term. I didn't dig into it as much for this one because David Bentler doesn't bring Buddhism into this third one, I think. So I didn't rely that much into Buddhism for this third step, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's just it seems you can kind of assume that it goes there. Like you've established these two categories and they're in some sort of relationship, so you can name that relationship somehow. Maybe yeah. I'm not sure if this is a specific Buddhist term. Okay, but then so I think Vervake's terminology. I think this is Vervake's, right? His ground of being and ground of intelligibility are those words he coined. Yeah.
For the first two sides, yes.
Okay, and then relevance realization is their meeting.
Yes, exactly.
So ground of being again is just this. It's being before it's been shaped, and then intelligibility. Okay, so before, in order to understand anything, it needs to be intelligible. In order for it to, it's like I was thinking a little bit about this just as far as like consciousness, or like even thinking about your symbolic perception article. It's like before you can perceive the world, it has to kind of pass through a filter of what you can understand about reality. Yeah, and so like you see some animal or I mean you see some moving thing, and before you even know what it is, you have to begin to categorize it a little bit. Oh, and it's an animal. Okay, well, what color is it? Oh, it's a green animal. Maybe it's a lizard, right? So all those things about what you can understand about reality, or what make it possible to understand it.
Yeah, and there's the idea that this ground of intelligibility is shaping the very being of things. Like even when I'm not looking at them, like what makes things have some definite form is a ground of all of those forms. It isn't like just potential popping out of nowhere willy-nilly. Like there are constraints that shape the things that actually emerge from the ground of being.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And this is it's still like super abstract to think about this, but I think it's like rather than trying to talk about it in those super abstract terms, you just need to kind of widen it and just keep. I think it's great that you gave a couple examples, and I think the example route is almost the only way to start to think this way.
Yeah,
but
I agree.
In Christianity, actually, let's come back to Christianity, because I think you and I have a slightly different way of teasing that out. But at least in Taoism, it seems that there's yin is kind of, I think that's yin would be the ground of being, and yang would be the constraints, and Tao would be the relationship between them. I don't know. I haven't read much in the Taoist tradition, but I think that's
I always tend to mix up yin and yang. I thought that yang was the feminine one, so this would be more the potential.
I did a little bit of yoga last year, and just based on my memory of that, they had a session called yin, and that was the really girly session where it was very relaxed and like there's no exercise, it's just like stretching and relaxing, and I was like, this seems like the feminine one, so that was how I remembered it, but maybe I'm wrong.
You know what, I'm just gonna Google it right now, because it's fairly simple.
I know that's definitely my wife's favorite sessions were always the yin ones.
Yeah, I think yin. Yin seems okay. Wikipedia doesn't help me right away.
I got the dark side is associated with everything hard, negative, cold, wet, and feminine, and that was yang. So or yin. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So
yes.
yin.
Let's be correct about it. It's not yin, right?
No.
Common mistake.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the feminine part would be more of the ground.
Like that's what I was thinking.
The ground of being, the potential.
Potentiality, okay. Yeah. And then Hinduism, I hadn't heard these words before, but you said there's Sat, Chit, and Ananda, which I looked that up later, and that's all like one word, Sat, Chit, Ananda.
Yeah. It's God. Yeah, but it's David Bentler uses those words fairly often to talk about it. Yeah.
Okay. So you've other than what you've read in his book, but I mean you read a little bit about this. Can you give a little bit more about those words? Can you tease them out a tiny bit?
Well, I haven't read in Hinduism exactly, but I do know that they map to the categories we've talked about. So Sat, or being itself, is the potential, the ground of potential, I should say, like the emptiness out of which things can spring forth is the ground of being.
Yeah.
And then chit is the intelligibility of things, the overarching set of like generative constraints that will shape the emergence from being, from sat. And then ananda is the bliss between the two.
Right. I like that word, bliss.
Yeah. That's a great word that David Bentlert uses. And on the one end, like it has to be something like this, just because being and intelligibility really do meet in things. Like potential and patterns really do meet to create things. So there has to be like a purpose to it all. There has to be some sort of destination, some sort of bliss at the end of it all, and it's validated by the experiences of mystics who can like reach this and experience this bliss. But even us in our daily experience, whenever we get to have patterns and potential meet, we get to taste this to some extent. Like anything we actually want, anything we find pleasurable somehow, ultimately points to ananda itself. It ultimately points to the bliss at the very ground of things.
Yeah. Well, see, and I love the way Vervake introduces these ideas, because he goes to something very, very, very palatable for any modern, especially young man. Because rather than using something abstract and like religious that maybe you haven't even grown up with a religion, he starts talking about video games right off the bat. He talks about how video games are essentially just flow creation machines, because flow is, again, another term that talks about that third category of like the meeting of constraint and potential, which that's essentially what a well-designed video game is supposed to do, and what it does do, if it's meeting your abilities exactly, or it's just pushing a little bit beyond your abilities, the constraints of your abilities, because that would be the constraint category, and the desire for like success. It's like success is just meeting your abilities, or the challenge is just meeting your abilities.
Like there's potential that's sort of out of your current reach in the video game, let's say. But you can there's a certain set of the video game that you can constrain, that in which you can impose intelligibility, let's say. And when you stretch your intelligibility into the realm that's just potential for you, then you do experience like this bliss, this flow state, where you're sort of just navigating between the potential and the intelligibility that you can bring it onto that potential.
Because the experience of, this all relates to like a difficulty curve, because some games, it's like the beginning of every game, you're just going to be establishing, figuring out the basic rules of the universe of that game engine, and figuring out, okay, how can I move around here? What can I do? Some games just kind of, they aren't fun because they just kind of, they get that difficulty curve wrong. They just keep it kind of easy, and they establish some concepts, and then it kind of peters out. It's like, okay, this is the game, and it's just hours of doing the same thing, and it gets very boring, because what feels interesting is constantly pushing you a little bit further, a little bit past what you've been able to do so far. It's like, okay, you just beat this level, and then the next level is going to be actually throwing something new at you. And I was just thinking about, I just recently started playing through the newest remake of Doom, and they do this really, really well in that game. The difficulty curve, it seems to me that it's perfect. Like, you just, as soon as you've managed one concept, they throw a new gun at you, or a new skill set, or a new tree, and it's just constantly, but it's not all at once. It's just, they give you just enough time to figure out how to use it, and then they throw something new at you. They're constantly pushing you into that new state of reframing your problem, reframing how you're going to play the game, and pushing you out of that. So it's just this constant flow state.
Yeah. You don't want to be like in a place where all you have is the intelligibility that you have already mastered. Like, there's no new potential for you to inform, but at the same time, you don't want to be in a place where there's just potential and you can't make any intelligibility out of it. And like, it's not pleasurable either. You have to be in the proper place between the two.
Sorry, Evan, can you just, I think the mouse is right in front of JP's face. So video games I just like, I feel like that's such a relatable example, but I wanted to even do a couple, because you do a couple examples like to do with like science and physics and stuff, which are great. Again, if you've gone deep enough into that training to follow those too, which I really haven't. I made it through high school science and stuff, and I really enjoyed my physics that I learned in high school, but like, didn't go much beyond that. Didn't learn a lot about like quantum theory or subatomic particles or anything like that. Just like a very brief overview. So I was like trying to follow along with that and like kind of making sense of it. But I want to maybe, I mean, a few examples that I thought of anyways. One of them is just communication. So, I mean, we have this, I mean, you have an idea, you want to talk about it, but there's something that constrains that idea, being able to communicate it. You can't just kind of like, I can't just insert my brain into yours and have the exact idea appear, the experience of the idea happen in your head. There's a constraint there, which basically is whatever communicative abilities I have. So, I mean, language would be one, but I mean, even facial communication. But language is a good place to start and kind of look at, because language, I mean, we can understand how language works, right? But language is the constraint to the idea that allows me to communicate it anyways. So, like, if I can communicate my idea really, really well, and I'm trying to think about that idea of like pushing just past my ability to communicate, but like sometimes where it's like my communication skills are just mapping onto my ideas, and it's like something's just flowing out really good. You can have that same experience of flow, and like especially a good conversation is when it's like both people are engaged in that, and like you're understanding exactly what I mean, or like it's just lining up, and then you're saying something back, and it's, even though there's this constraint on our ability to communicate, it's like somehow that's even like building some momentum. I'm thinking about it like even in terms of like, you know, water passing through a smaller gate, like a bottleneck. It actually like it creates more pressure, and it becomes something more energetic when it has to go through that bottleneck to point. I don't know if that is a good analogy.
Yeah, I wonder how to map it exactly, because let's see that the constraining doesn't, I mean, it does at some point come to limiting something, but it doesn't necessarily have to be with, I don't think it's exactly the same as the way in which language limits what we say. Because, okay, I like the dialogue aspect you brought into it, because one thing you can say is there's potential on what we could say. Like there's, I don't know, like 5-10 different things that we could like, I mean, there's billions of things we could say really, but like there's a few paths that we can discern like between what we could say. But from like all of that potential, we will constrain it down to something that we actually say. We constrain it to just one thing, one path through all that potential that we actually say. And this comes down to the language you were bringing. And I mean, this happens all by ourselves, even if you're just like one person. And as you said, we can even get into a total. You can be all alone by yourself and still get into a flow state just speaking, because you're playing with your ideas, like you're stretching your potential into like, all of the infinite potential of things you could potentially say. You bring it down to something small and intelligible that you actually do say. And if you can do it in a way that is meaningful, that actually has like,
it's like your intelligibility is actually growing as you're engaging it with that ground of language or ground of ideas. Yeah.
And then when you're two people doing that, you can sort of get into a deeper, it can give you more potential when you're two people engaging in this sort of discussion, because like, I mean, you have sort of two nodes which can like play with all of this potential, and like the person saying something can make you think of something else, and like you get all kinds of new paths, you get all kinds of new potential, and you can then constrain that down to new things that neither of you could have thought about earlier. So I mean, it's how I think I would map the constraining idea, like out of all the things you could say, you constrain it down to something that
it seems like even just that word intelligibility, fundamentally, I don't know, it seems to me that it has to do with communication. Like, and I don't know if this is going to bring us down into the rabbit hole of perception and what's really real, but at least as far as like talking to somebody, or even it's just any understanding of things is communicative, because even if it's not talking to somebody else, there's different parts of your brain communicating with each other in order to have an intelligible idea of reality, or an intelligible thought, right? Your left and right hemispheres are constraining each other's input and perception, which is another one of the examples I wanted to look at, is like McGilchrist's example of like the left and right brain, and then a cohesive thought, happening between them when they're properly engaging with each other. Although, I mean, he even goes right out and says that it's not just one they don't neatly map onto it. It's not like the one side of the brain is responsible just for constraint and the other side is responsible just for potential, even though they kind of loosely map onto that. They're both actually constraining each other as well, in the same sense that when you're having a conversation with somebody, there's obviously one person who's smarter. In this case, it's you, and and you have a constraint between the two people who are engaging in the dialogue, and one is kind of more. I mean, probably in this case, I have more scattered ideas that I'm just throwing out and hoping that you can kind of mesh them in and constrain them a little bit more. But it's happening both ways as well, because we're both having a conversation with each other.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe we can jump. I mean, I can run through a few of these more, but then I want to go to the Christianity one, because Peterson has his chaos and order, and then existence is a meeting of the two. Chaos is kind of the ground of being, and order is kind of what constrains. Freud, I think it might map kind of like the id and the superego, and then the ego, maybe.
I don't know enough about Freud. I have no idea. I only know tangentially about Freud through Peterson. I couldn't know, like, what does he mean by those categories exactly?
So I'm going to have to be pretty loose. I've read a little bit of Freud, but I mean, there's so much you can, and I mean, it's difficult sometimes to follow, but I think the id is kind of like, again, kind of this more sheer, almost instinctual, or just like the drive, the urges of your self.
Okay, yeah.
And then I think the superego, I think it might have to do slightly with culture, or just kind of the constraints on how you're going to behave. And your ego is kind of what feels like most like yourself. Or and I think in Jung's in his terminology for these three categories, he would actually use the word the self, I think. So I think for Freud it would be id, superego, and self would be kind of the mediator, and then for Jung it would be unconscious and conscious awareness and self. Maybe again, maybe there's not a perfect mapping, but I'm just kind of loosely seeing if I can plug those things in.
Yeah.
And then, actually, recently I was just reading Matthieu Pageau's book, and he talks about, and this is a great one too. He talks about wisdom, understanding, and knowledge.
Yeah.
Where wisdom would be these kinds of very, very vague. Again, I think that's kind of the being. It's like it's the most abstract form of an idea, but then he talks about even the symbolic. It's like, okay, so you have an idea, but you don't really. I mean, somebody explains a concept to you. It's like they kind of somewhat outline the concept, but you don't actually begin to get it until you get some examples. And then when they give you that examples, you get understanding. And he uses this imagery of like those are the beams supporting the idea. So there's the idea at the top, or the wisdom, and then there's the understanding, which holds it up, which literally it's standing under the idea. It's understanding it. And then when you have the wisdom and you have the understanding, then you have knowledge of the idea.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, I didn't remember exactly that mapping. But yeah, in Matthieu, you find lots and lots of examples of this, where there's like there's the body, there's the head, and then there's like the person that unites all of, like those two. There's in a group, let's say you can have the king, you can have the people, and like you have a kingdom that meets all of those.
Right.
You have all like how potential and patterns can meet in general. Like he talks about the earth and the seed. Like he gives tons and tons of examples of this in the book. I don't think he uses the exact terminology I don't know if he uses like potential and logos ever explicitly, but it's always like still the idea of like you have some ground of possibility, and then you have some intelligibility that comes down and informs that potentiality.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, obviously the natural progression for Pierre is to start thinking about, all these, there's three categories and they interact in this way. That there's three categories in Christianity. We have three categories for God. We have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But your intuition went a totally different direction here for how to map that onto them. So maybe you could first kind of give your outline, and then I'll tell you mine and see if we can find a midway point here. Maybe we could find a bliss in between our perspectives.
Yeah. So I mean, I went the way that David Bentley takes it, which seems to be similar to a way that at least some of the church fathers were taking it, especially in the East. You have the idea that the Father is the ground of being that is sort of always hidden, always furthest from us, but gives rise to everything. And then it's through the logos, through intelligibility, through the shaping, that you'll see the Father manifest. It's because there are patterns that will happen on potential, that we will see things like actually be created, like things will all together. You won't just see raw potential because that would be nothing. But so it's through the Son that you get to see the Father, and then in this relationship between the ground of being and the ground of intelligibility, between the Father and the Son, you have the Spirit, you have the bliss, which is like the ultimate purpose, you can say, of everything. Like the Father does everything towards the Son in the Spirit and bliss, and vice versa, and we strive to participate in that. So that's the way that David Bentlert laid it out. But you had a different intuition?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just partially. I think I can even argue this pretty well. I think about the Father not as being the ground of being, because the Father, at least from what I've kind of starting to learn about mythology and learning about, especially like Peterson's unpacking of a lot of different myths and stuff like that, Father oftentimes has to do with like society and government and rule. So it would seem that I would relate the Father more to the intelligibility category. It's like that's the constraining factors on being, right? It's like the law, or it's like, especially you think about the God of the Old Testament is the Father. He's the God who gives the commandments and stuff like that. And then you have the Spirit, which I mean, in the Genesis account, the Spirit is like hovering over it's like the Spirit is associated with the chaos that is the universe is going to be created out of. The Spirit hovers over the waters. Which, I mean, I guess you could read that as, okay, there's the Spirit and then there's the waters, which are below. But I'm kind of seeing it's like there's the Father in heaven and then there's the Spirit down below with the water. And those seem to be, especially in the symbolic understanding of water, just being chaos or being non-beingness, being nothingness, right? Which, as far as I know, I think that's in Hebrew, or at least in like the ancient cosmology, water literally just, it doesn't mean H2O, it just means nothing.
Yeah. There's an important twist in that you don't want to say that the Father is the potential itself. You want to say that even, like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So even the earth, like even the water, like the potential was created. Sometimes I'll say, because of that the Father is the ground of potential. I think I read that in a few places, where I don't want to say that the Father just is potential. I even triggered Jonathan at some point by, in a conversation, like speaking of the Father as being like, sort of below, as being the potential that is then informed by the Son. And like this, of course, would get things backwards. Like you want the Father to be untitled.
Right.
But like the idea is more that the Father is the ground of everything, of the potential and of the intelligibility. Like it wouldn't even make sense to have the Son without the Father, to have intelligibility without something that gives potentiality to be informed by patterns. So like you have to imagine the Father the way that like lots of it of Christian mystics especially will talk about him, like or even the way that Christ talks about him in the Gospels, where the Father is not visible to anybody except through the Son. Like he has, like, nobody can see his face and live. Nobody has seen the Father even. Like really, we would say that the theophanies, the apparitions of the appearances of God that you see in the Old Testament are Christ, ultimately. Like people don't see the Father himself. The Father is always hidden. He's the ground of potential. He's the ground of everything. You don't interact directly with him. You enter what you get to see is always shaped through the logos. Right. I don't know if that helps, but yeah, it's not an easy topic.
So yeah, you said that it's getting shaped through the logos, which logos, that word makes a little bit more sense to be. But again, it's like, depending on what perspective you're looking at it, logos could be that meeting of the idea and the constraints on language. It's like, okay, so you have language and then you have an idea and they meet in a word, and the word is what is their meeting. It's that mediator between the constraint and the potentiality. And I mean, the one other thing I wanted to point out is, so even in, let's see, in Ecclesiastes, there's the Kohelet. He talks about everything is nothingness, everything is vain, everything is habal or habel, which is like nothingness. Everything, or the word is vapor or spirit. So again, it seems like there's an association between spirit and nothingness, which it's not the same word as in the Genesis account, which is ruach, but it seems that there's still a relationship there. So I'm not sure. Obviously I don't know Hebrew, just know how to use Blue Letter Bible. But and then Christ says that he is the way, which again, the way, that sounds to me a lot like the Taoist thing of like the way is Tao. It's like it's the way in between potentiality and intelligibility, or chaos and order, or yin and yang, right? It seems that Christ is, and again, I kind of think about it as a sort of family relationship, like, and I know that there might be something heretical to saying that the spirit is like feminine or like the mother, but it's like there's the father and there's a mother which create a child, which I would see as Christ. But I don't know. That's where my mind's going, and I'm still waiting for somebody to give me a good critique of that. But that's how I understand the Trinity as far as mapping onto this set of terms. But.
Well, I mean, things get difficult too, because there is, like, we do have the idea that they ultimately share everything. So like you'll find, so that you'll be able to find symmetries in all of this stuff. And I think this could be what we're getting into here, in some places at least. Trying to see like what else I've seen about the Trinity that could help here. Okay, so there's the old filioque thing, like how is it that the different persons of the Trinity can coexist, and like what and now it gets into all kinds of interesting language, but basically you want to say that all three are not made, but you can speak of begottenness. So like the Father is unbegotten, meaning that he's like necessary, eternal, and all of those things, and then he begets the Son. So you can say that it's because there's a ground of being that you can then have a ground of intelligibility, that you can have some constraints on potential, and then it's because you have those two that you can have the third person, which is a meeting of like potential and patterns. So you get this step of like you have the Father, then you have the Son, then you have the Spirit, and like all three sort of rest on the Father. And like it's by this sort of priority of persons that that the tradition has talked about them. But now there's something else interesting going on with, and I think it gets to what you said earlier about like that you can seem to propose different mappings. And I know that especially like when they're in all of the controversies in the first few centuries where people were trying to like specify whether or not Christ is divine, and then later the same issue popped up with the Holy Spirit. And the way that the Church Fathers solved this puzzle was to look at the different attributes of the different persons of the Trinity throughout the Bible, and they saw that like they all had the same attributes. But yeah, so that you can see all three doing the same things, like in different places, but there will be an emphasis, and like even you can even get a feel for that if you like practice Christianity, because you'll tend to invoke the Father or the Son or the Spirit for different things. Like if let's say you prefer like healing or something, if you pray to like be in communion with your spouse or somebody else, then it'll typically be more of the Spirit, like like some unity across people, something more invisible. If you're like praying for like some miracle almost to happen, like something to spring forth, then you'll more invoke the Father. If you, and then you would invoke then the Son, I think, more for like time,
like liturgy. I feel like, I mean, I feel like you're more praying to, well, I don't know. I mean, you're at least focusing on the Son more in the liturgy of like the church and stuff. It's like we're coming in, we're remembering Christ as we like eat the bread and drink the wine and like have atonement, like coming together and stuff like that. I feel like that's maybe more focused on the Son, but I mean, again, I think you probably still pray to the Father in those moments.
Yeah. I mean, we even say like all three all the time. Like we say in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. We'll say like in different parts of the Mass, we'll say that. Let's see, we're worshiping the Father in Christ in the communion of the Holy Spirit.
The sign you just did, that probably more lines up with the way that you're talking about it too, is because you see the Father is up here, the Son is down here. And then there's the Spirit kind of in mediating. So maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. It just, that makes a lot of sense to me.
I mean, if you come back on Genesis, in the beginning, it's interesting. If you look at the words are different. Like in the first step, it's in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So you have like the primordial division that comes from God, and then you have something different that pops up. Then it's after this first step of God, like the furthest, like at the very origin of things, not only temporally but ontologically. It's after this that you see the Father and the Son pop up, because it's afterward that you'll see that thing can be spoken into being. You'll see, let there be, let the blah blah blah. So and then God said. So you have the word, you have the constraints, you have the intelligibility, and like the word, this word is associated with quite explicitly in John's Gospel at the very beginning of it. Like in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. So like there's this word that is that through which the Father creates. You can say that's explicit. I mean, it's after God creates the heaven and the earth, then it's the speech, then it's the word that will shape things, and then the Spirit is sort of what hovers over the face of the waters. It's sort of the mediating. I come back to that word you used earlier, like the mediating thing. But it's always harder to see the Spirit in all of those things. But I think it's because of this sort of mapping that. And I know that there are other reasons for this that I'm not super familiar with. Apparently, even in around the time of Christ, and for a few centuries before that, there was like entire schools of Judaism that were already speaking of a Trinity, because of like what you can see in the Old Testament, where you had like already three hypostases, three persons.
You see them in Genesis, right? Like,
that's
what we're just talking about.
Yeah. And then you can trace it still in other like places of the Bible. Sometimes it mentions the Spirit of God. Sometimes you have weird passages that I don't exactly remember, but you'll see like there's like Yahweh who is manifesting himself like to somebody, and then he invokes Yahweh up in the sky. So like you have two Yahwehs. Like you'll have this kind of stuff happening, and like it'll be like the Logos invoking the Father. So even before Christianity, you already had this idea of like different, you can say, layers of the same divinity, and you could see that in Greek thought too. Like it became more clear in Neoplatonism, which was after Christ anyways, but even maybe in Plato and Aristotle, like there were
is there
ideas bubbling up in Greek thought.
Is there a way to map this
similar
onto their? I mean, I haven't read any of those guys. I've just heard kind of indirect stuff. Can you bring it over into that realm a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, there will be more differences between Neoplatonism and Christianity than there will be between Christianity and the traditions that I mentioned earlier.
Right.
But still, you can kind of try to stretch it. So in Neoplatonism especially, it's where this comes clearest. The most fundamental divinity is the one. So it's the oneness of things. And you can still say that it's the ground of being.
Sure.
But it's the very possibility for things to exist at all as one. So like the kinds of arguments that Plotinus will use to talk about this is the idea that like, how do you know that things are one at all? Like for things to exist, there must be wholes that are not just simple separate parts. Like there must be some overarching things that grabs things and pulls them together. And we have this drive, even like you'll see that, let's say we ask the reasons for things. Like we if we have two explanations for something, like we have the idea that there must be really like one more fundamental reason behind all those things. Like we want the unified theory of physics, for instance, because we know that there must be like one overarching like ground of all of those things that we see.
It seems impossible to know that, though. It's just like it just seems so right. It's like such an intuitive, like, well, if we see it here, we just always kind of the inductive pattern is to kind of think, okay, well, how far up does that go? Probably, especially, I mean, when we're seeing this is such an ancient way of dividing up the world, an ancient way of dividing up cosmology and viewing the world, that it's okay. It's like everybody has this intuition, so it must be right. But is that, like, how do you test it? Is you just kind of, you appeal to the majority, you appeal to all these traditions? I mean, that's my strategy anyways.
Yeah. I mean, kind of. It's you can go through the arguments to the best of your ability, but at some point you'll see that, I mean, it becomes impossible to like say exactly who's wrong and who's right at some point. Like you can agree on a lot of stuff still, but at some point you have to like try it and like see the fruits. Like you can read about people who tried this way or that way and see where they ended up. and you can try and pick what you think will work best for you. But like you do have to ultimately try it. Often it's just shocking. I think it reminds me a bit of the last conversation we had, Garrett, where like in some of those, it's that if like the stuff that Plotinus was talking about with regards to the one, for instance, it's almost
wait, Plotinus.
Plotinus.
There's Plato and there's Plotinus. Are these two?
Yeah.
Okay.
Plotinus is about Neoplatonism.
Okay.
It's the idea of the one I mentioned earlier.
Okay.
That's from that's Plotinus.
Okay.
But I mean, it's more than an argument, really. I think what Plotinus does is he shows us that if you don't agree with the idea of the one, then you're sort of cutting yourself at the knees, because we work this way. Like our cognition works this way. It does seek the one. Sort of all of what we use to make sense of the world rests on the idea of the one, even though we're not aware of it. So if we don't agree that there is really this one out there, and it's not just in our imagination, then I mean we're in big trouble. Like if we don't agree that like this points to something real, then we're bereft. Like what can we do? Like if something that is so fundamental to our cognition doesn't match to something real, then we might as well just stop. Like there's no even what are you gonna do?
This is the only place conversation can begin about this. So if this isn't good enough, then sorry, we can't have well, I mean, so you go to nothingness. You just like, okay, if this isn't good enough, then nothing's good enough, right? And then you just kind of you throw off the shackles of conversation at all and just stop trying to solve the problem. Is that? I mean, I'm not sure if I'm kind of skipping ahead a little bit here, but I mean, you get into this this discussion about nothingness and overcome nothingness. I mean, even the title is like evil and enlightenment and Easter, which is about like death and resurrection, like so, which you associate death and nothingness, right?
Yes, to an extent. Like it's not all there is, but yes, there's definitely no association there of like going down into death is one kind of falling into nothingness, and like it's especially the negative sides of nothingness. There's like Nishitani does something interesting, like of how you can flip nothingness. But yeah, definitely there's an association between nothingness and death. Yeah.
Is that something unique to Nishitani's take, or is that, or do you know if that's like pretty standard? Because I mean, I tried to read last year, or maybe it was the year before. I listened to an audiobook of it was something by the what's his name, the Dalai Lama. It was called For the Good of All Beings, because I was just like, okay, I had just kind of had this general idea. Okay, probably if other religious traditions have something to offer, I want to try and give them a chance and start trying to pay attention to some of these other guys. And I didn't know where to start other than the Dalai Lama. So I read this book and I found myself getting so frustrated by it, because it seemed like such a lopsided cosmology. It just seemed like it's just all about nothingness and all about how nothing actually exists, and there's and it's like I was like, okay, I can see the value of that attached to a greater story about like finding true being and doing that through nothingness, but like I didn't see any of that in the. I mean, I had a hard time finding it anyways, because there's such a focus on the impermanence of everything and the nothingness of everything, and I didn't see anything redemptive about that. It just seemed like a fundamentally nihilistic and depressing way of talking about reality.
Yeah, I think it's like really an attempt to, on the one hand, shock us and like make us realize like how much of ourselves is just.
He's just trolling.
Like, I don't want to say illusory, because at some point they do say that all of those layers are being untrue, but like they want to shock us away from like thinking that we're sort of crystallized and we exist like at the levels at which we think of ourselves. Like they want us to realize that, okay, we're not just our thoughts, like our thoughts rest on something more fundamental. We're not even like just you can just keep going down the ontological chain and you don't find anything solid. And like even it's really great now, because with like what we know from the last century of physics, like at the bottom of it all, there's just potential. Like there's nothing. So like you really just like, you can go through all of those layers, and like the Buddhists keep saying that's nothing, that's nothing, that's nothing. Like you just keep going down, and at some point you reach like really nothingness where there's just potential. And
which I feel like we might even figure out ways to. I mean, we might get lower than we currently have. We might figure out new observational, more particularities of way, like to get lower than we've already gotten with our understanding of the physical laws of the universe. I don't know. I don't know that much about physics, but even if we do that, it's like there's still going to be a level below that always. That it's like, well, you just can't get to the bottom. There's a nothingness below that.
Yeah. I mean, and like actually, even the nothingness is already there. Like, I mean, we know about all kinds of layers of particles. Like we know about, let's say, atoms, we know about protons, neutrons, we know about quarks and electrons. Like we know about like a certain layer of objects, you can say, but we know that below that there is like just potential. Maybe we'll find particles below those as well, but it won't change to the fact that we already know that there's just potential.
We've already hit bedrock, but we might find some other layers in between there where we already hit.
But I mean, and it's not bedrock, like it's just potential. Like you can do math.
It's not even a bedrock.
Yeah, you can do math and like have probabilities of what will spring from that potential, but it's definitely like just potential there. Like there are people who try to interpret things some other ways, but I think if you look at the philosophy of physics, what all of the interpretations that seem most elegant are the ones that go back to Aristotle, that say that, okay, well, the reasons why things behave this way is because at the ground there's just potential. Like we get probabilities because it's real probabilities, like it's really potential. So
this is where it gets a little bit hard to follow. So that there's real constraints on, and maybe it's again just because we're kind of too far into physics, and I haven't learned enough about that stuff. But there's real constraints. If there's real constraints, then how is there totally unrestrained nothingness below those constraints? Or am I still misunderstanding that relationship?
That's a great question, because I mean, like whether you go east or west, there's a really old idea. I don't know like how far back it goes historically in the east, but in the west it goes back to Parmenides. That's like, I don't know, 3,000 years ago maybe. It's a really long time ago, and like because he hit on the idea that being and intelligibility are interchangeable. Like they ultimately point to the same thing. And like if you're trying to speak about the potential at the bottom of things, it's nothing, because there's no shape at all, as you said. So I mean, you'll see that, like you'll see that in Aquinas, you'll see that in like the Christian fathers, you'll see that in the East. Like there's like this potential doesn't exist in like as thingness. Like it's you can really say that it's a kind of no thing.
Yeah, I'm smiling because this is reminding me of there's a YouTuber called Greg, and he talks a lot about all different political ideologies and just kind of rips on everything. But he was the first person to introduce me to political horseshoe theory. I'm not sure if you've heard of that.
Yeah.
Okay, but I mean, it's like I see that same pattern of, okay, there, from the perspective of a functional society, you have different directions you can go. You can go more liberal or more conservative. But if you go down to the bottom of either one of those, you get to nothingness. There's no society anymore. It's utterly uncohesive. There's nothing there. Like it's totally fallen apart, and they're basically both are just chaotic nothingness, where there's no shape and there's no potentiality. There's no freedom and there's no law. There's just not. It's not a society. It's not cohesive. It's not a thing anymore.
Yeah.
Right. Which is it's interesting. I mean, you can even look at various countries who have struggled with falling down one of those ends of that horseshoe and just see. It's interesting because if you ask somebody who's very committed to a leftist ideology, about these different stories in history, like Hitler and Stalin, they'll point to them and say they're all actually just evil conservatives. And if you ask a conservative about them, they'll tell you, oh, those are actually all evil communists, basically. They're all just socialists, and just socialism gone wrong. And it's because they are. They're all both of those things. Or neither, really, because they've got so far past either one of those things even being a thing that they've descended into the nothingness of not being a government at all anymore.
Yeah.
But, okay, so let me see if I can make my way back from there. But so at least we can see, though, that it works on a political level, too. And that was one of the first things that...
Yeah, I haven't really thought about that much about the political level yet. I tend to keep things pretty abstract, but I need to work on finding concrete examples, and politics may be a good way to go.
It makes a lot of sense to me because even within the terms there, like you have conservatism, which has to do with keeping things the way things they are, restraining things, and liberalism, which is literally to do with freedom and getting out past the restraints, right? So it's right in the terminology. So I feel like it's a pretty easy step to make.
Yeah, well, there's definitely the chaos and order thing that we talked about earlier, but. Yeah, I want to be careful about, let's say, trying to associate the Father with chaos, because I could run into the sort of issues that you raised earlier about like seeing the Father as just sort of the potential below, and that would be weird because you do want to say the Father comes first.
Yeah.
So,
although it may just, like I'm running into that same problem myself, but I think it's just enriching my understanding of those terms like chaos or femininity and these things, and just making me kind of consider them more deeply. It's like they seem frustrating because I have so much baggage associated with those terms sometimes, but then when I put them into this metric, sometimes it informs them and gives me a kind of a deeper, you know. So I'm not exactly sure, because sometimes you're still going to run into a lot of situations where you start using those words and people are going to become very confused.
Yeah, but I think it's that's all perfectly normal. Like there's no like one final doctrine about the Trinity, really. Like in the church, there are all kinds of different ways of speaking about it, because we talk about it as something that is super intelligible, like that we won't exhaust it. Like there are things that are unintelligible because they're just false, or they don't make sense. There are things that are intelligible, that we can make complete sense of them, but then there are things that are super intelligible that we will never fully grasp because they just escape us. So like if we try and wrestle with them, it will keep generating insights. Like you'll get better grasp of those concepts and things around you, but like you won't have a final grasp on the Trinity, for instance.
Is that okay? You mentioned Gödel's incompleteness theorem in our last conversation, so I looked into that a little bit, and again, I'm not a mathematician. I can barely even remember how to do algebra very well, but I watched some videos about what those theorems were actually kind of explaining about systems, and that made a bit of sense to me. I think, anyways. The two statements basically that his theorems prove is that you can't have a system that reflects reality. Or if you have a system that's representing reality, it can either be complete and inconsistent, or consistent and incomplete. Is that right? I think that's true. There's no like, or maybe there's something slightly wrong. I'm not sure, but definitely, if you have a system that talks about everything, like it's wrong, or it's no. I mean, if it's complete, it has to be inconsistent. Like if you have a formal system that is complete, it has to be inconsistent. And any system that you have that is consistent will have to be incomplete. Right. So mathematics is sort of trying to be a consistent system, and it wants to be complete too, but there is this relationship, I feel like, that you just said, where it's like there's a super intelligibility to reality, where when you try to describe it mathematically, you can continue in that relationship forever, and so there's like an infinite depth of math that you can continue to go down that rabbit hole, and it continues to be rewarding and interesting because you're continuing to it's an inexhaustible conversation, in the same way that the conversation about the Trinity is inexhaustible. You're
right. I hadn't thought about it, but that's true. Typically, I use the example from below, from physics, that like no matter how many particles we find, we'll always have potential below, as Aristotle said.
Right.
But like what you just said with Gödel, like sort of does the same thing from above. Like no matter what system of intelligibility you find, there's always higher intelligibility, above it. Like we can prove it mathematically that there's always intelligibility that escapes your current structures of intelligibility.
Yeah, and it's like. I don't understand how you can prove that mathematically, but it's so interesting that he managed to do that. It's like, okay, well, at least I could take that. This is a smart guy anyways, and he says that, so I could base some arguments on it anyways.
I mean, I don't remember the details, but like it's rested on on creating a paradoxical sentence. In the same kind of way that if I say that this sentence is false, I'm saying something that breaks, like intelligibility, that doesn't make sense. If my sentence is false, then it'll have to be true. But if it's true, then it'll have to be false. So what Gödel did is he created something like that using a formal, where I think like he basically came down to trying to show that a certain proposition, and what the proposition meant was this proposition is undemonstrable. Something like this, and like he ended up showing that if you can show that
you can't demonstrate it, undemonstrable.
Like this proposition is undemonstrable, and like this sentence would be codified logically, like into like a string of symbols. But what he showed was that this sentence that you've just constructed is actually paradoxical. Like it will break your system in the same way that if I say the sentence is false, I break like the rules of logic. Like he did the same thing, but within mathematics. So like he showed that this formal system, he showed that all formal systems can be both like complete and consistent. So it's like the details, like working through the details can take like several weeks or months, depending on your mathematical expertise. But like the basic idea is about creating a paradoxical sentence.
Yeah, which is as soon as you create a paradox, that's That's the easiest way to start a really, really long conversation that doesn't have an ending, but oftentimes leads to a lot of really rich rabbit holes. Like I remember when I was in Bible college, I spent like 10, 15 plus hours with my one good friend Andrew talking about whether or not God could create a rock too big for him to lift. I feel like that problem's been kind of thrown around as a joke in Christian circles. And it's like, it's so easy to just brush it off. But as soon as you try to engage with it, it just pulls you into this rabbit hole of like talking about so much interesting stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah. And I was even recently listening to Ian McGilchrist. I think it was a lecture, maybe it was in the book, but I think he was giving a lecture talking about this is in the book. He was talking about what a paradox even is, as far as cognitively anyways. And he explains it as basically your intuitive sense-making and your deductive sense-making coming to different conclusions that are both accurate given their perspective of the problem. It's like...
yeah, that's a good way of speaking about it.
Where it's like they're actually, neither one of them is wrong. They've both they've followed the rules of the way that their perspective works. Like your right brain reaches an intuitive. This is my right brain. I'm looking at myself. Your right brain reaches an intuitive conclusion based on like a holistic understanding of the situation. Your left brain reaches a more or less logical conclusion based on a more focused perspective of the problem. And they've followed their rules correctly. Neither one of them has made a mistake, and they've reached the correct conclusion given their premises, given the kind of attention they're paying to the problem, and they're opposite answers. And so that just, it's interesting. I'm thinking about this. I teach songwriting a little bit, and because I write a lot of songs, and one of the things I've been talking about with my students is like, when you're struggling through a problem, you're trying to figure out an interesting way of representing it. You look for paradoxes, because that's the way you can get people to engage with your concept on a deeper level and catch them off guard, because paradoxes are frustrating, but they pull you into the conversation. They pull you into a concept. And so like even I feel like a common lyric, like I hate how much I love you. It's like, it's when you hear that, it's like immediately you have two understandings of what that lyric can mean, and it pulls you into thinking about, you get stuck inside of the mind of the lyricist a little bit more, because you've engaged the full brain.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it fits with like some of the traditions we mentioned earlier, because in Zen Buddhism, like it's all that, like all you have are Zen koans that like challenge your structure of intelligibility by throwing you into some sort of paradox, and then you have to work through it. And it's in the working of it that you like reap fruits. And then in Christianity, of course, you have Christ who like keeps saying parables that confuse people, and then his own life is a parable that confuses everyone. Right. Yeah. So you have this. Yeah, that's the way to, sort of try and shock you into new perspectives.
Right. Which that shock thing is okay. I think I'm understanding a little bit more. It took a while to start to process what the Dalai Lama is telling me about nothingness and like engaging with that, because I guess they, like you said, they really want to pull you into that journey and shock you. It's not just about a very intelligible answer. It's about bringing you through this experience of having to encounter nothingness, so that way you can get through it. Can you go over a little bit of what you did in your essay talking about this, or even talking about kind of Nishitani, the way he talks about nothingness and how it like flips it on its head?
Yeah. So what Nishitani does is, I think it's a standard move in Buddhism, where you do like shock the reader into realizing like the nothingness of their self, of their emotions, of like their society. Like you basically get to see all of your typical levels of ontology are illusory, and you keep like going down and down and down. And it's not just, let's say, just by the way that I tend to think, I talk about it in terms of ontological levels, but you can also use other like much more common experiences, like the experience of death, the experience of terror that we have for like something that may come up, like all those experiences that shock you away from your normal being and throw you into some sort of nothingness, some sort of absence of what you're typically in. Like all of those things are sort of making you move towards non-being.
Right.
But
Is that
at the
even,
very
you use the word
Go ahead.
terror, that kind of reminds
Yeah.
me of thinking about the fear of the Lord, or like the terror of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It's like when you're shocked out of, or when you're totally terrified because your understanding of reality has fallen apart, like that's when you can begin to encounter wisdom.
Yeah, it's awe, like the terror that you have before something that is like wholly other than you and nonetheless exists. But yeah, so I basically picture it as like going down all of those layers into nothingness, into nihility. That's the term that Nishitani will use all the time. But what he then explains is that you can, like, you don't have to get stuck there. And Nishitani goes through different figures in the Western philosophical tradition, and like point how many of them were able to sort of go down the layers and challenge, let's say, the supposed reality of things according to our society. Let's say you can point to Nietzsche or Sartre, like all of those people who like showed how our common conceptions rest on illusions. But like you shouldn't stay at the level of nihility where you just challenge everything, because ultimately you can turn that on its head. Like even the fact that you're stuck at this level, well, that is also
It's due to you not fully embracing the concept.
yeah, it's also like you can doubt nihility itself. Like you can doubt that this very level of being is true as well. And what happens, and for Nishitani this is it isn't just a, let's say, intellectual exercise. Like this is religion for him. Like it's a religious experience to realize and seriously grapple with like the nothingness of the different layers of your being. But ultimately you can reach a point where you see how, well, this nothingness is actually giving rise to all of the other layers. Like it's as if initially you just sort of chip away, and you get to the very ground of things. But then you realize that this ground like can fall prey to the same kinds of doubts that you have. And by flipping this at this point, you make all of the other layers real again.
Right.
And you see that actually, like, it's because there's potential, it's because there's this nothingness, that all of the other layers are real. Like the things don't just exist sort of by themselves out of nowhere. They have to rest on something that is necessary, something that is like sort of self-sufficient, in nothingness that gives things their oomph, like their fire, things that like brings them into being. So like after you have gone through all of those layers and you see yourself as made from this nothingness and everything around you made from this nothingness as well, then you re-emerge back. And like Nishitani will talk about this as a sunyata, as a perspective that you now have where you unite all of those layers and you see yourself as profoundly anchored in non-being. And then it'll also flesh out into seeing others around you this way, and even plants and like inanimate objects, as all sort of in a communion from non-being.
So it's a doubt of doubting almost.
Yeah.
It's reminding in our last time we talked, you challenged me on. You asked like, I said I'm not certain of anything, and you said, "Are you certain of that?" Which I've had people throw that at me before, but just thinking about that again recently, I think where we got mixed up there is that thinking about certainty as sort of a yes or no, or like a Boolean variable, like something that's either true or false, and I think that's where you run into a problem, because certainty is not. It's not that you either have certainty or you don't. You always have varying degrees of certainty.
Yes, I mean that's true, but sometimes you can be absolutely certain of some certain things. Like sometimes the probability has to be 1 or 0. Otherwise you won't even get off the ground. Like even like what you just said, that everything has a probability, let's say, between 1 and 0. Like you have to say that this has a probability 1 of being true. Because otherwise, like,
right. Or else, but again, when you commit to that system of it has to be yes or no, then you follow down this trail of nothingness too. Though you follow that system to its very end, this like a closed logical system, and you see that system falls apart eventually as well. I feel like.
I'm not sure I quite followed. Like, if you take what's the hypothesis you take? If everything is 0 or 1?
Yeah, if you have a simple system, again, you're trying to represent reality with it. This is an extremely simple mathematical system where everything is either true or false. then eventually, according to the incompleteness theorems, right, is if you eventually get to the end of that and your system can't comprehend reality and you find a place where it breaks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think you do have to at some point reach the idea that for at least, like, most of your beliefs will be provisional. Like, it will be probability between 0 or 1. But I do think that to get off the ground, you do need to say that some things have probability 1 of being true. Otherwise, you just always undermine yourself, and you can keep doubting. But like, it's better to like go with, okay, Plotinus, I grant you your point, and then you move forward.
Well, I mean, with this, this relationship with Sunyata, or this relationship with absolute nothing, which did that concept kind of landing for you, Evan? Does that make sense after given the context we've kind of given, like getting to the bottom of nihilism, and where like you're doubting whether or not anything exists, and then you get all the way to the bottom and doubt whether or not your statement about everything even existing is meaningful.
Yeah, I've heard that one before.
Heard that one before.
I think that works for me.
Okay, awesome.
Okay. That's what I was hoping for. Okay. I mean,
and you can kind of go in.
No, stay here for a second. What do you got?
Yeah, I mean, because like once you have this insight, like what I find really great is like how we can make all of those ontological layers real. Like you can flesh it out into a metaphysics that you can actually inhabit. Like once you go back to the traditional cosmologies that we talked about earlier, Garrett, with like potential at the bottom of things, and then intelligibility that will shape all of that potential to create beings at all of those different layers, like from particles to cells to humans to societies to like ecosystems. Like all of those layers become real. Like you don't have to like be skeptical of morality like Nietzsche. You don't have to like be a sort of Richard Dawkins reductionist of all things down to genes, let's say. You can say that all of those layers are real.
Right. So the intuition is that this, and I'm still trying to figure out how this works, because again, you're saying so that there are actual constraints, but to say that there are actual constraints, are there limited actual constraints? Or because again, if there's limited actual constraints for the manifestation of reality, then it would seem that you can find the bedrock of, like, you could eventually solve the problem. You could eventually see God. You could eventually fully understand the way everything works. You could eventually reach the bottom of math where you do have a system that represents all of reality.
Yeah. They do have to be infinite. And the way that and language can get tricky, and sometimes we take shortcuts so that things aren't too long. But in the same way that when I didn't want to speak about the Father as potential itself, I want to say that, okay, strictly speaking, the Father is the ground of potential. Similarly, you don't want to say that the Logos is, let's say, just all of the structures of intelligibility. You want to say that he is that which gives rise to the structures of intelligibility. And definitely there will be like an infinite number of patterns of even just in the created world that we see, there are an infinity of patterns, like for sure. Like there's even like, that's another cool thing that happened in mathematics around the time of Gödel, I think a few decades before Gödel. But there's a Georg Cantor, I don't remember which country he was from, but he showed that there's actually layers of infinity, like, and you can have like infinities that are infinitely bigger than the lower infinities, and it just keeps going infinitely. So like I think so it means that even for, let's say, the structures of intelligibility that shape the potential in the world, like there's an infinite chain of like infinite like layers of this intelligibility. I don't think it's exhaustible any more than the potential of the ground layer physics is exhaustible.
Or the relationship between math and the universe, or the relationship between the left and the right brain over a paradox. I
think it's exactly what you mentioned earlier with Gödel. Like there's no finite system, like there's no finite intelligible systems. Like it just keeps going up and up and up and up into the Logos.
Right. Okay. So I want to get into the resurrection, but before we get there, I want to just do two kind of brief more examples about the nothingness being kind of saving, and maybe we can get I mean, it's still kind of a fuzzy concept for me, but at least I can kind of narratively grasp it in The Lion King, for one thing, anyways.
Yeah.
I think it's a good example because, again, everybody knows this story. This is basically one of our in the North in the Northwest, our cultural myths.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that story, you've got Simba, who is like, he's the protagonist. He's the main character, and he's presented with this opportunity to be the king, right? And he has a grand idea of what that means. He watches his father like roar, do a super big roar, which is, to him, it's like the coolest thing ever. And he sees him like kicking all these different bad guys in the butt and just being super badass. And he's like, that's about as far as his understanding of it goes. It's a pretty simple understanding of what being like the heroic father, this intelligible concept of being a hero is. And he like wants to act that out. So he develops an idea of what it means to be a hero, what it means to be the king. And he goes out and he immediately, he breaks the rules and he goes out into the wild to go and start doing this. And he starts, there's this opening dance sequence where he's just singing a song, I can't wait to be king. And then obviously there's kind of a foreshadowing of what's going to happen is like he's kind of wrangling up all the animals and then they just fall down and it's total chaos. But I mean, at this point, he's still he's kind of just having fun in the universe. He doesn't see the consequences of his actions. And he doesn't see them until his like role playing of what he thinks being a hero goes a little bit too far when he, first of all, he goes out and he kind of meets the hyenas and he explores a little bit into the Badlands and realizes there's a little bit of a limit there, but he still continues to kind of want to, after that, he's kind of a little bit frustrated and he wants to go over, he goes down into the valley, which again is a very symbolic location for this to happen. He goes into the valley and is kind of, I think he's practicing his roar. And it's as, again, he's trying to act out this inferior understanding of what it means to be king. That he's not supposed to be in the valley, I don't think. And and then there's this stampede. And due to his own negligence, his ignorance, and his acting out what he thinks it means to be a hero before he's ready, his father dies. It's literally due to his actions. I mean, he doesn't directly kill his father, but he understands the connection between his actions and the death of his father, and obviously that's very upsetting. And so, I mean, that's a really relatable story up to that point. It's like, okay, we all grow up with a little bit of an understanding of what it means to be human and how we're supposed to live, and at a certain point, that understanding totally just knocks us on our butt, and it's like we realize we don't get it, and there's a retreat that happens there. It's like, okay, usually you get so frustrated with life that you just want to totally run away from responsibility, and you have this experience of basically what you go and embrace some level of nihilism, and that's exactly what Simba does, right? He runs off into the forest. He runs off into the woods, which is like into nature, into the maternal, into Mother Nature. He goes and returns to the womb, where he's stopped being a human, and he's just gonna leave his role that he's playing totally to the side and just go in. I mean, he's not thinking about being reborn at this point. He just wants to escape his responsibilities, and then he even embraces this philosophy of not caring about anything, of Hakuna Matata, right?
Yeah.
No worries. I'm not going to worry about anything. I'm not going to try to constrain my behavior at all. I'm not going to try and live out any particular principles. I'm just, whatever goes. I'm just total nothingness.
Yeah, is he lion eating insects?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's not acting the way a lion usually would. He's just, which is weird. Yeah, he's not following like even an instinct. He's just below all that. It's just total chaos. It's just randomness. It's just, and he's hanging out with a meerkat and a wild boar, which is not a usual kind of friend for a lion. But I mean, that even further speaks to like the understanding of how a lion is supposed to act. Like, anyways, he's there anyways, and it's from that perspective that where he's stopped trying to be a king, where he's able to then begin to see what it really means to be king. And the responsibility is presented to him from well, especially it's presented to him from Nala. She comes back and kind of presents there's a real need, and this is what being a king actually looks like. It means coming back and standing up for your people against Scar, and this is specifically what it means. And like he's given a new practical view of what it means to be king, and he acts it out, and he's we've gone full circle. He's made his arc, and now he's entered back into being king. But I mean, it's going to be cyclical, because even though he now has a new model for being king, it's probably not enough. He's going to have to continue to descend into nothingness. But now he has a relationship with nothingness. Now he understands Hakuna Matata, and he can return to Sunyata and be rebuilt constantly whenever he runs into a situation where his intelligible understanding of how to be king fails him. He can kind of return to that state and allow himself to be rebuilt.
Yeah, and I think the step where he beats Scar at the end is also important for like this final step of transcending death, because I mean it's Scar who killed his father and who almost got him killed as well. Like this first encounter with death that made him retreat. Like ultimately he has to go back down to death, but now transcend it and like take the place that is his by going through Scar and the hyenas and all of those other people. And even like the entire kingdom had become death by that point.
Yeah.
Like the entire thing was dying. So like these, it's like you can say that Simba sort of went into death when he wasn't ready, when he was too young, and like he had to retreat. But as he did that, then death was spreading for the kingdom, and then what he had to do was to go again like through death, but this time actually make it through and like destroy it and then reestablish the kingdom.
Yeah. Which, so you would say that he did. Well, there's like two moments of him doing it. I'm not sure how to distinguish that, because like he first he meets Timon and Pumbaa, and he's like, maybe that's just kind of the more the positive side of death. Anyways, it's like a very comfortable, lazy. Like there's no constraints on it. There's no expectations. It's just like he learns.
Let's see the positive side of potential.
Yeah, and then he's, once he understands the positive side of potential, then he's able to face the negative side of potential, or the negative side of death, which it seems weird to associate death and potential, maybe if you haven't heard that association before.
Yeah.
But like, if you think about it, the only way you're able to create new things, I mean, even if you've got building blocks or Lincoln logs, the only way to make new structures is to tear everything up, so that way you can now make some new idea, right? Yeah. I was even thinking about this. One more brief example. I was thinking about, because yesterday was Mother's Day, and I was just thinking about sort of the symbolism of the role of a mother. And I want to even write something about this, because it was good. Last time we talked about how mother and matter, those are the same root word, and they both have to do sort of. There's a really ancient association with. Well, I mean, obviously, even just biologically, it's just in the womb. That's where you're being formed. That's where like the father puts his seed into the mother, and then it's like it returns to a state of not being, so that way it can then be formed into a new individual. But I mean, what I'm thinking about a lot of times growing up, where like, especially kind of relating to the Simba story, I had like expectations for how I was supposed to act, or especially how my day was gonna go. I had a rough relationship with expectations for like plans, and whenever my expectations for how the day was gonna go didn't work out, I got really frustrated and really upset, and I would have a temper tantrum. And I made it through it various different ways, but I remember as a really young kid, one of the most surefire ways of helping me to get through those situations was literally the hug of my mom. And it's like, there's even a symbolic thing where it's like, she's holding you now. So there's this almost like this structure, this circular structure that holds you up so you can return to this state of nothingness. It's like an egg. She takes you back, or a womb. She takes you back into her womb. And there's even little kind of signals that she'll make where it's like just a calming voice, or even my mom used to go shh, 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 which when I say that sound now, it triggers something cognitively in me where it's like I go back to this state of just feeling totally comfortable and totally relaxed. And I think that might even be a sort of a signal of like some of the sounds you hear in the womb of like I think I read that somewhere, but like that has a similar sound to like blood pumping through and stuff like that. Or like you close your eyes and you cry. It's like all these different things kind of return you to a state where there's just like you're letting go of all of the tension. Even the act of crying, that convulsion of that's a muscular release of tension, where like all of the ways in which you're tensing yourself up and stressing and trying to meet a situation, you're letting all of that go, and you're returning to this nothingness state where you don't have a plan for how you're going to be anymore, or how the day is going to go, and it's just like your mom holds you and she says it's okay, and then you're able to be reborn out of that hug and go back into the world. And that's exactly how it happened for me. It was like once I'd had that hug, that comfortable hug, that just like that took away all of the expectation for how I had to be and how I had to act, then I was able to go and approach life again and do it and try to approach a new understanding of how I should be acting. And I think that's a good, maybe we can segue from that right into Christ, right? I mean, does that kind of line up pretty well with your kind of retelling of the Easter story?
I hadn't thought about it exactly this way. I think I like the way you just said it, and it makes it makes me understand better why you explained the Lion King story this way too. Of like you, it's like there are good and bad ways of going into potential, of like going into nihility. If like you can fall into the non-being of death, or you can fall into the non-being of like potential. And like initially Simba went into the non-being of death, and then he had to go through the non-being of potential to finally go through the non-being of death. And what you said with your mother lines up, I think, in the exact same way. Let's say, in order to go through the non-being of like the problems of your day, you like it helps to go back to the non-being of potential. See, in your mother, and I'm gonna try to see if I can weave that with the Christian story itself. At least the way that I had explained it was that let's say the psychological and religious experience that Nishitani describes as taking place within your psyche is something that Christ does, but narratively, like at like the narrative scale, like in his person. So he goes through like all of the layers of nihility that I talked about earlier. Like he subject himself right away to, you can say, scar, and to also like all of the bad stuff that happened within your day. Like he does this at like the narrative scale. Like he's betrayed by all of his friends.
Right.
He's betrayed by the state, by his religious authorities. He's like he's tempted by the devil. He's tempted by all kinds of things he could do instead. He's like he's tortured. He's beaten. He's ultimately hung naked on a tree with criminals. Like the whole story is him plunging into death, plunging into nihility.
Mm-hmm.
But in the same way that there was a flip that happened in the Buddhist story, there's also a flip that happens in the Christian story when Christ reaches like all the way down to death, because he's the logos himself. He's the very ground of constraints that we talked about earlier. That's who Christ is. So like once the principalities and powers of this world, once all of the negative nihility has attacked Christ and put him down into death, sort of brought him back into like the potential, where his body is just dead and sort of decomposing in the tomb. Right. You can say, even like going down back into the earth. Like once he reaches back down into that potential, what you see isn't just like a complete dissolving. What you see is rather a new creation, because you've taken the logos, you've taken the ground of constraints that gives rise to everything, and you've put him back into potential. So like what's gonna happen? He's just gonna like create new things. So like that's why you have Christ coming back from the tomb. And it's really analogous to what I said with Buddhism earlier, where after you've gone through all of those layers and seen like all of the bad patterns that you're engaged in, seen all of your all the layers of your being as illusory, and once you've sort of let yourself doubt all the way down, at the end what you find is like there's still intelligibility there. You can just doubt that death, and then the whole thing springs back up again. And like that's what Christ did by bringing intelligibility, by bringing the ground of intelligibility down into potential. What you see is like the springing forth of a new kind of life. So that's how I established the parallel between Christ and what I saw in Buddhism. And I think maybe one way to say it is that whereas we have to go through the two paths we talked about earlier, let's say the forest and like and scar, like those two things are different for us, or like the world and your mother, like while those two things are different for us, for Christ they were always the same. So by like submitting himself right away to scar, he was still like in contact with all of the potential that was available in the forest, and like by submitting himself to all of the troubles of your day, it was still like full of all the potential and comfort of your mother. So like he did things like in complete continuity all the way through. So that's why you see like he's always flipping all kinds of symbols and things that are happening to him. So for instance, he has a crown of thorns. Like that's a very ironic way of calling him the king of the Jews, and it's meant to be insulting, but it's true, like that he's the king of the Jews, and even makes that like a glorious part of the story. It even helped it has helped the Christian story that for Pontius Pilate to do this, because in the end, like it's a really powerful symbol for Christians who are persecuted to identify with Christ with the crown of thorns. Like the same thing with, like, he has the sign, Christ, the king of the Jews on the cross. Like they dress him up as an emperor. Like there's all of these like travesties that people try to push on Christ, but he always ends up flipping them back. And it goes super deep.
Now we even have like crowns of thorns, oftentimes like ornamental in churches and stuff, and it's like it doesn't. He destroyed the negativity of that symbol. Now it's like a beautiful symbol of the passion of Christ.
Yeah. And the crucifix itself, like the old thing that was really supposed to be like that. This is scar. Like this is all of the negative side of nihility. He completely flipped it. Like it was turned into his glory, into the greatest thing that ever happened. Like the cross, which is on the one end the worst thing that happened, because it's a going down into death, like through all of the wars that the world has to offer. But at the same time, it's the greatest glory, but it's because it's what grounds everything at the same time. So in the same way that let's say the Buddhist who reaches enlightenment by going all the way down and then realizing that everything arises from this ground, like it's sort of the worst and the best thing that happened in his life. Well, the crucifixion was this, but at the cosmic scale. Like it was the worst thing that ever happened, that we did this, but it's also flipped into a new kind of life that's the best thing.
The best thing, exactly,
happened.
Yeah. So one of the things, I'm not sure if you actually said this, but I for some reason this was how it was landing for me, is that like the reason that Christ rises from the dead, like the reason that inevitably happens is because when you destroy like pure perfect meeting of intelligibility and being, like the way it's supposed to meet, and you just take it apart, then obviously every time you take something apart you get a recreation, and it's eventually going, I mean, just, whether it's like if you just throw a dead body into the earth and bury it, eventually decomposes and becomes plants, which then people eat. And I feel like I'm talking about the Lion King again. But there's a circle of life. But with Christ, it's like you kill him, and then because it was already like, normally it's like you kill something, it dies because it's made an error, it's living in sin, or like I had this experience of like, having, as a really young person, getting really frustrated with my day and then breaking down because my understanding of how to live wasn't sufficient for reality. And so, that was a result of, like, it had to break down because there was something wrong with me. And so then when I become reborn, I act differently. But Christ, since he is, whether, historically or mythically, he represents this idea of perfect meeting of intelligibility and being. And so if you destroy that, it comes back exactly the same way. Or maybe not exactly, I mean, because...
Yeah, it's interesting because you want to say that the intelligibility came back exactly the same way. Like the logos itself didn't change.
Right.
But its human incarnation did change. You do want to say that...
people didn't recognize him at first.
Yeah. I mean, never, like, really. It was always super confusing. Like, he would, like, appear in places and then vanish again. Right. He would, like... People would not recognize him, and then they would start... then they would recognize and not recognize. Like, it would sort of go back and forth. And a good symbol to understand it is one that Christ uses himself, namely the seed that falls in the ground and dies. There's, like, the seed that goes down into the earth will have to die. Like, the seed will sort of be eaten by the earth, but the information that's in there, like the intelligibility, will end up informing the earth that was trying to swallow up the seed. And then, like, a tree will spring up that is different from the seed, but that's, like, a new kind of life that was hidden, you can say, in the seed, and that will itself make other seeds then. So I think it's something similar to that's going on with Christ.
I think it's a Zen saying where and this is really popular because, a lot of people were like into New Age a little while ago, but like there's the little phrase like, if you love something, set it free, and if it was truly yours, it will come back to you. Right. I think that's, even though it sounds very like cheesy, I feel like it gets at the same concept of like when you enter into death, when you destroy a relationship, you set something free that you think is yours, then you allow for genuine or like the real thing to emerge. Like when you get rid of your illusory understanding of like, or maybe you're just lying to yourself. You think that you have a relationship with this animal or with this person or with this thing. If you let it go and you stop forcing just your own will onto it and your own understanding, you let that die, then you will maybe begin to experience something, or something will emerge that is like, that's deeper than just your constraint, your understanding of reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Well, I mean, that's, I can't say that dryly because this is the most exciting thing to ever happen in history, right?
Yeah, this story. Yeah. I mean, it's really, because the claim is super dramatic. It's that ultimately, like, this will encompass everything, because like you can have enlightenment in the individual person, say through Buddhism or other exercises, but there's no claim that this will ever become cosmic, and it's kind of normal because it happens at the level of the individual. Like it's something that you do like within yourself. And I mean, obviously you can found schools and so on, but still, it wasn't something that happened at the narrative level that like shocked people into it really. Like, and it's really good to remember the apostles in all of this, because they were super confused by what was happening. Like they didn't understand any really of what was going on. Like at the cross itself, like only John, the youngest, was there with the women, and then everybody thought that Christ was just dead, except maybe Mary. Apparently Mary, like she had a good idea of what was going on, but like all of the others were super distraught. And like they go to the tomb and they're crying and like they really hope for nothing, and the apostles are sort of just brooding in the room. And then even when Christ reappears, they still don't like get what's going on really. Like because it's sort of the biggest parable. Like when you are reading Nishitani or the Dalai Lama, like they keep saying things, but it may not be that shocking because I mean, at some point it's worse. Like you have to really like make a conscious effort to get into it. But like for the apostles, like they were really shocked into like understanding it and like not understanding and not understanding and not understanding. And it's only at Pentecost, so like 50 days after the resurrection, that like it finally dawned on them. Yeah. And you have to imagine them like they finally understand the story. So like it's described in the story as, you know, tongues of fire falling on them, and then they were able to explain what was going on to people around them. So you have to imagine them like in a room, like they're, I don't know, 10, 20 people, and like they're praying, and then all of a sudden they start understanding what was going on. So they're like, oh, I know, like this time when the loaves and the fishes, that was because of, and then this other guy, like as this other insight, okay, well, he rose on the tomb, and it links up. So like you have to imagine those people like
having all these aha moments.
Yeah. And they finally get it. So at some point they get that. So they've been shocked into the narrative, and now they're gonna themselves spread it, and they're gonna go through the same pattern that Christ did. So they're all gonna be martyrs, and they're all gonna found churches. And it just will keep growing.
And it's never gonna be something that they can just explain and just tell. It's always gonna be something that they're going to have to shock people into having an experience of and having to personally enter into that narrative. But so, what's the difference though that you're saying between? So these other traditions are there. You said the word you use is local. They don't. Why is the Christian one, why does it reach further? Like, I mean, I can think about just having a tradition that spreads out and like, you know, starting a religion, but there are other religions that started, and even these other potentially enlightened figures you talk about, like Socrates, they have schools that spawned because of them, and their message does continue to spread out, and it does take kind of root.
Yeah, that's interesting because you don't really see the universality of the claims of Christianity elsewhere. Like Nishitani writes this at some point. There's no real even historical consciousness within Buddhism, like of the idea that history will come to be like full of people who are enlightened. Like it's sort of just not even really a question. Or like the Taoist Chinese empire didn't care much about like expanding itself. Like it just wasn't really there in the cards. Like they didn't seem to care that much about what was going on in like savage Europe and all that stuff. And
well, even Judaism, for some reason, like they don't want other people to become Jews.
Yeah, they wanted more of it, like initially, but like the idea for Judaism was really like purity. Like it was like creating a body. That's how you can say it. Like God
totally
training
focused on this intelligibility and this certainty and law.
Yeah. Yeah, and so they had all kinds of restrictions, all kinds of constraints of stuff they couldn't do, and like it was making them more and more special from among the other people. And like they can only eat certain things, they have to say certain things, they can't engage in certain practices. Like they become like a really specialized body, and it ultimately culminates into Christ himself. And the goal was that eventually it's through their holiness that the entire world would be brought into Israel, but like it had to happen through this fashioning of one body. But just to come back more explicitly to your question, the idea is really that like the sort of universalist claims that you see in Christianity, you don't really see elsewhere. You see that in Islam that comes after Christianity. But it's kind of rare that you'll have this dramatic claim that the entire cosmos was remade by like one story. And historically, it seems to be what's going on. I mean, it's taking time because it has to spread through the entire world. Yeah. But this pattern I mentioned earlier of Christ dying for the apostles to get it is replicated in the apostles dying for churches to be founded. And then even like it just keeps going where like you can see the church, let's say in the Roman Empire dying as the church in Europe is taking shape. And then you can see the church in Europe dying as the churches in America, in South America, in Africa are springing up. Now there's a lot of churches underground in China and other places in Asia as Christianity seems to be dying in the West in general, but it has sprung back up in Russia. It's like it's always this cycle of death and resurrection that started with Christ, but sort of just keeps expanding. And now, I mean, if you think about the numbers, it's pretty crazy. Like the number of Christians that there are in the world, it's very high. Like it's 2 or 3 billion, depends on how you count it. And even if you count, like even if you look at Muslims, because still in that religion, you still have Christ coming back at the end of the world to fight the Antichrist. Like he's still a super important character in the story. Right. It's like if you look at like how much he has colonized the world, like he's like one of the central figures in the lives of like 4 or 5 billion people on the earth right now. That's pretty good, and it seems to be like really like making its way to like encompass the entire world.
And I'm not even sure if because I know within Buddhism there is an idea of like if you are a bodhisattva, like a person seeking out becoming a Buddha, you have, once you kind of reach enlightenment, you have the option to like go and just exist in total nothingness, or you can go back and be a sort of a manifest Buddha. I forget what the word is, but like, or maybe that's what even a bodhisattva is. Maybe I don't know the terminology exactly that well, but like once you've reached enlightenment, you can come back and you can go and guide others towards enlightenment. So there seems to be an intuition that like you want to bring other people into it. Though it's strange that it's a choice that you personally make rather than that just being the expectation for everybody. I don't know why they leave it up to you, but I'm not sure when that was introduced to the Buddhist tradition, or if even that is potentially an integration of some Christian thought.
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's a good question. I haven't looked into the potential influences from Christianity into that. I know that I think it's in Mahayana Buddhism mainly.
Mahayana.
Yeah, I always mix that one up, but I know it's where it sprang up, and it's really interesting. I should check, because I mean there have initially for a while in the first few centuries of the church there was actually a strong presence in the East, including in India and China, but it died out. I don't remember when exactly, but I think it had to do with like the Mongol invasions, and at some point also one of the Chinese dynasties like who really clamped down on everything like that didn't come from China. So yeah, lots of stuff went on, but anyways, bodhisattvas.
Okay, so it's got to go out everywhere. But I think you even talk about this, that fundamentally this is not a provable thing. It's totally an intuitive thing that, again, if you experience it and you begin to relate it to your experience, it just seems so deeply true because it lines up with reality on every level. It's like we're pointing at all these examples of like the brain, and even like, I mean, as you're talking about this descent and emergence, or this like death and resurrection, I think about the most fundamental mechanics of staying alive, like breathing and the heart beating, right? It's literally that exact same process. And I saw that there's great imagery of this an album that the band Gungar did a little while ago. I forget who, or somebody did some art to do with one of their songs, but they just talk a lot about breath, and like it's literally, one of the main lines that goes throughout the album is every breath is give and take. And it's like, it's literally, somebody draws this beautiful picture of like, of lungs, but also being like trees. And there's like, one is spring and one is fall. Because again, there's that pattern, there's a cyclical pattern of death and life in the cycle of the year, but that's the cycle of like, you can't hold on to your breath. You take it in and you try to constrain it for a little bit, and then your lungs give out and they let go of the air. And then they have to, it's like, you can intuit this pattern about reality by staring long enough at literally any part of the universe. At least that's the intuitive claim that you make if you deeply believe this is true, that no matter where you look. And I think there's even Christian theology that, or it's like basically he who seeks finds, right? That's a verse I remember when I was younger, like wondering, oh, what about people who haven't heard about Christianity? How are they going to find God, or why would God judge them? But it's like, literally, if you look for God, it'll appear no matter where you look.
Yeah, St. Paul writes about this in one of the epistles. I'm not sure where exactly. Maybe it's in Romans, I'm not sure. But yeah, the fact that, I mean, and tons of philosophers have done this, and like we talked about different traditions, like Hinduism and Buddhism, and how they wind up finding things that gets close to the Trinity anyways. Like, these things are fairly fundamental. And like I wouldn't want to say that it's, let's say, just an intuition. It's more, I think it's really interesting if you look into how it is that, let's say, fundamental shifts in perspective come. It tends to be more about, like, I'm going to give you something, and then I'm going to take a bunch of time to show you what you can get from it, and then you're going to adopt it. And it's even how scientific revolutions go. For instance, when, let's say, Newton wanted to show people that he had found the laws of gravitation, like, initially, it's not convincing at first, because what he gives people is like 3 equations. Like, look, guys, I found these 3 things, and like I can explain all of planetary orbits with those 3 things. But like, by itself, it's not really an argument. What you have to do is you have to take those things and see how you can explain all of those different things. You don't get from elsewhere.
Has to like die and then reemerge in the soil of mathematics or of astronomy or whatever.
Yeah. You can't sort of point to the seed from outside and make sense of the seed, because the seed is a new thing. It's that through which you will see things. So it's what happens with scientific theories. When something really new comes forth, you don't explain it with different things. You rather try to use it to explain things, and then if you do explain things, then people will adopt it. And like, it's also how people undergo transformations in their own lives. What will happen is, like, you will come to see the world from another perspective, and like, it's not. So basically, maybe you have a conversation with someone and they introduce a new idea, and this idea becomes a seed in you.
Right.
Like, then what will happen is that through time, you'll see something or hear something, and it will sort of ring a bell in your mind. Oh, I remember that this guy said this thing, and that's interesting. I hadn't seen this thing the same way before. Right. But this seed can keep growing, and at some point, you will realize that you see the world more through that seed than through the rest of your psyche. And like, this is a conversion that has happened. Maybe it has taken months or years, but like, it's the same process as Newton convincing people that his theory was the right one. Like, you have to like sort of receive the seed and like see what you get out of it. Yeah.
And it is that process of like, you hear an idea that sounds outrageous to you and you just kind of brush it off. You literally just kind of like, it dies to your mind. But the more, like, it's like you've at least understood that as like a very basic principle. The more true it is, the more that as you just continue to live, it will grate on your mind, and it will take form. It's like you can't get away from it because it is true, and it just naturally springs up. Like, somebody told you the truth, and so now you can't get away from it. You know now, and then you begin to see it everywhere.
Yeah.
So
it's not just an intuition, let's say, but. Yeah, I get what you're pointing at. I just want to make the caveat, because it can be easy for people to sort of dismiss intuitions, but it's how any significant transformation happens, really. That you have to learn to see the world this other way, and then you see whether or not it's better than what you had before.
Well, and that's even the way intuition works. I mean, I remember at the beginning of my high school class on geometry, they laid out the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning, which I always kind of associate that between like logic and intuition. It's like you can learn something via establishing a set of rules and then playing with those rules and seeing what they pump out and seeing what's possible within that system. But you also learn things totally asystemically, where you just observe the world and see what seems to happen, and then you kind of take note of the patterns. And that's even usually the ground level below your logical systems, is that you just kind of base those axiomatic rules on what seems to be true, what your intuition about reality. So I don't really have a lot of issue with using the word intuition, because I feel like it is a fundamental part of the way we reason and know anything anyways.
Yeah, I agree. That makes sense said this way, and it's going to help people who could be dismissive of intuition.
Okay, well, you go a little bit into death and stuff, but I think it's getting a little bit later, and I feel like I'm kind of at the end of my ability. But maybe, well, I want to just read the last paragraph of your essay, and then see if you want to kind of wrap things up from there. Mm-hmm. Which the last paragraph is, I thought it was a very humble way to end I think some of your best work, one of the best essays I think you've written. But you ended it by letting somebody else take the wheel, which is such a beautiful. I feel like it's a little microcosm of this whole principle of like you dying and letting something else. So I think the last paragraph is David Bentley Hart's book. What's it called? Something in the Sea?
The Doors of the Sea.
Okay, yeah, I think I want to pick that one up.
It's really worth it, and it's super short. Like you can listen. I got it on audiobook, and you can run through it within a few hours, maybe 2-3 hours.
Oh wow,
it's pretty short, yeah.
Okay, so that doesn't feel as much. That doesn't give me as much anxiety adding that to my book pile. It's getting pretty tall right now.
And I would even like if you're maybe half the book is like refuting other positions, so this may not be as interesting. Personally, what I really liked was the second part of the book, where like he jumps more into like how he sees things using Saint Maximus and other saints. So this was, I think it starts with divine action, like it's really the second half of the book. It starts with divine victory, I believe. I'm not sure, but yeah. So like if you really don't want too much like to add to your pile, like at least like the second part of this book, it's really short, and it's the best work I've seen on this topic.
Well, also if it's audible, sometimes that's easier to power through too. So I think I'll definitely read that pretty soon.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the way the essay ends, and it's very moving. So David Bentley Hart says, to see the world as it should be seen, and so to see the true glory of God reflected in it, requires the cultivation of charity, of an eye rendered limpid by love. Maximus the Confessor taught that it is only when one has learned to look upon the world with selfless charity that one sees the true inner essence, the logos, of any created thing, and sees how that thing shines with the light of the one divine logos that gives it being. But what the Christian should see, then, is not simply one reality, neither the elaborate, benign, elegantly calibrated machine of the deists, smoothly and efficiently accomplishing whatever goods a beneficent God and the intractable potentialities of finitude can produce between them, nor a sacred or divine commerce between life and death, nor certainly nature in the modern mechanistic acceptation of that word. Rather, the Christian should see two realities at once, one world, as it were, within another. One, the world as we all know it, in all its beauty and terror, grandeur and dreariness, delight and anguish, and the other, the world in its first and ultimate truth, not simply nature, but creation, an endless sea of glory, radiant with the beauty of God in every part, innocent of all violence. To see in this way is to rejoice and mourn at once, to regard the world as a mirror of infinite beauty, but as glimpsed through the veil of death. It is to see creation in chains, but beautiful as in the beginning of days. It's good.
Yeah, David Bentley is quite the writer.
Well, I hadn't heard of him before this, so I'm definitely going to have to dive in a little bit to his stuff. I'm definitely going to read through that book.
Yeah. Maybe to finish, I have like just one question for you, because you told me that you enjoyed our last conversation, and it was almost surprising to me because I felt like often my points didn't quite land during the conversation, but like you seemed quite enthusiastic, and like if you have more pointers as to like what you found helpful, especially, yeah.
Well, partially it was, I mean, even just what we talked about today, as far as like you can explain things and you can give very elegant explanations for certain things. But sometimes what really helps people to understand something is walking with them through the shadow of the death of their ideas and having the experience, like the shock of like having to engage an idea and work through it. And so, I mean, there were some things that you said that just really, I mean, maybe then to you they seem kind of benign and just simple, but to me it was like, oh, that made a lot of sense. But there was other things that where we got in our conversation that just were like, I don't know, it was just really comforting to get there and feel like you were on the same page and like walk through it. And then ultimately the way we even kind of summed everything up, you're just talking about the experience of practicing out Christianity, that when you begin to act out this pattern, this story, it's true. And it's like, you don't have to worry about whether or not you can prove it's true. And you don't have to wonder about whether or not you're right. It's just, you will experience the truth of it if it's true. And that, like, I guess it just gave me some hope thinking about, like, I used to have such a strong sense of, like, feeling like I knew what God was, and I had a very clear understanding of my definition of, like, the feeling of God. Like, I grew up in very charismatic circles, and I felt like I had such a strong identity and such a strong relationship with who and what God was, and relationship personally with God. And then beginning to unpack some of that as an adult was very sad in some sense, because I lost something that was really important to me, because a lot of the ways I had framed my relationship with God didn't make sense to me anymore. And just hearing this hope that if I live out the Christian story, that I could maybe have a genuine relationship with God it's really exciting, really moving to me. So, I mean, it was just you telling me to be a Christian that moved me so much.
That's good. Yeah, that's very nice. Thanks for explaining.
Well, thank you for walking through that valley with me.
Yeah.
Well, that was interesting. If you enjoyed this conversation, feel free to share it with a friend. Or, even better, take whatever you found interesting here and go and have a real face-to-face conversation with somebody that you care about, or somebody that you don't understand very well. I think face-to-face conversation is one of the most important tools that we have for building and maintaining real relationships and real communities. Many institutions in our lives have an incentive to crowd out these longer, more engaging interactions with short-form junk food content. I get it. They're just trying to make money. The point of this project for me is to spend some time pushing back against some of those forces in my life. I want to practice listening to and engaging with people that I don't necessarily understand very well. I also want to spend some time listening to and learning from some people who seem to have a good track record of listening to and engaging with people that they disagree with. If you're interested in working on some of this stuff too, feel free to keep up with this project by subscribing and pressing the little bell thingy that lets YouTube know that you want to keep seeing these videos. I really think that if we can get better at conversation, we might actually change the world. Anyway, thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.